Good evening. It is certainly wonderful to be with you again this evening. If you have your Bibles, be turning over to the book of Exodus. We're going to be spending some time in the book of Exodus, not really any particular chapter. We're going to be anywhere from Exodus chapter number 2, really all the way out to Exodus chapter number 16. So just throw a marker there in the book of Exodus somewhere, and you'll be close as we flip back and forth between something that we look at in the Old Testament. One of the things that I love about the wisdom of God is that God can take something and it can be so simple, and He can make it and He can illustrate it in such a way that you really almost have to try to misunderstand it. Another thing that is beautiful about God, kind of what we're looking at on Sunday morning, is the fact that God is a consistent God, that throughout time, God operates in the same ways. He does the same things for His people. The lesson that we're going to look at tonight is a lesson that is entitled just simply God Provides. I think actually in the bulletin I put God Provides for His people. But one of the things that we're going to examine this evening in regards to God providing for His people is sometimes God will provide for His people when they really don't even deserve the provision in which He is going to offer. And so we're really going to look, I guess if you wanted to break it down, there could be 3 points that we're going to look at this evening, but really going to focus on 2 main ideas that God does for His people. And so if you're taking notes, we're going to look at the idea that God provides physically for His people. We're going to look at some accounts in the Old Testament, really in regards to food and water that God provided for His people. Then we're going to look at the New Testament, where God still provides for His people. And so an idea of a physical element of our God providing for us. And then the next thing that we're going to look at, the last thing, is going to be that God provides spiritually for His people. He provided spiritually in the Old Testament for the children of Israel, and we know that God provides for you and I spiritually today as well. And so as we're considering these 2 points, one of the beautiful things that we can probably, most of us can probably relate to, if not all of us can probably relate to, if you think back to maybe when you were a child, right? When you were a kid growing up, in your parents' house. And, there were probably times in your life as a child that you did things that your parents did not approve of. And as you were doing those things that your parents did not approve of, they may have had to instruct some discipline. They may have had to provide some correctional insight, if you will. But even in those times where as a child, right, there's always that saying that parents always want to tell their children right before they're getting ready to discipline them. That first time, this is going to hurt me as a parent more than it's going to hurt you. And as the child, you're thinking, how in the world is this going to hurt you more than it's going to hurt me? I'm getting ready to get a belt across the behind or whatever the case it may be. But then as you grow up and you become a parent, you understand how that statement is true. No parent really enjoys that type of discipline as far as their child is concerned, but it is something that's necessary. But even in those times, as a parent is having to discipline their child, as the child is not enjoying the disciplinary moments, there's something that the parent still does for the child, still provides for them. Even if your child has done something that it just infuriates you and you're trying to correct that, what do you do as a parent? You still provide for your children. And that's the beautiful thing about God. Sometimes as God's people, and we're going to see in the Old Testament, looking at a couple examples, sometimes God's people would do things. We're going to look at the children of Israel in the book of Exodus, and so you can imagine some of those things that they would do. As God's children would do certain things, God even at times would have to, discipline them, correct them, bring them back. But what is He going to do? He still provides for their needs, not only physically, but also spiritually. So let's consider then a couple of these ideas together. Let's consider the fact that God provides physically for his children. There's two accounts that I want to look at, maybe actually probably three, that I want to look at. We're going to go through these probably somewhat quickly just because we don't have a whole lot of time to spend on them. But go to Exodus chapter number 15. Exodus chapter number 15. This is not long after the children of Israel have come out of Egypt. This is not long after the children of Israel have crossed the Red Sea there, and they're still traveling, and they come to this area where they need some water, where they want some water. And if you look there at Exodus chapter number 15, and you look at verse number 22 and following, it says, "So Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water." Notice that. Here they are, they're traveling, they're in the wilderness 3 days, they have no water. And they came to Marah. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter, and therefore the name of it was called Marah. So here it is. Here they've left Egypt, they've traveled into the wilderness 3 days, and when they finally find some water, guess what? It's water that they can't even drink because the water is bitter. And so you look at what the children of Israel are going to do. Even within the next verse, it says, the people murmured against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink? What are we going to do? You brought us out here in the wilderness. We've had no water for 3 days, and we finally find some water, Moses. We can't even drink it. Moses, what are you doing?" Now, that's the people murmuring. That's the people complaining. That's the people not being grateful for what it was that God had already done for them. But notice what happens in the following verse, in verse number 25. "And he, that being Moses, cried unto the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. When he had cast it into the waters were made sweet, and there he made for them a statute and an ordinance, and there he proved them," or there he tested them. What's the point? So here it is. Here is God's people. God's people are in really a dire situation, because you get to thinking about what happens. You get about 3 days without water, and what happens? You're dehydrated, and if you don't get water soon, you're going to die. And so they finally found some water. They can't drink the water. They complain, but what does God do? He says, "Moses, there's a tree over here. You go over here, you cut the branches of this tree down, and you put it in the water. And when you do that, you know what's going to happen, Moses? The water is going to be made sweet, and you're going to be able to drink of that water." What do we have an example of? We have an example of God providing for his people. A similar account just a few chapters later in Exodus chapter number 17. Just fast forward a few chapters, Exodus chapter number 17. And here you have the children of Israel. They're traveling again. And look at verse number 3. Exodus chapter 17 and verse number 3. "And the people thirsted there for water, and the people murmured against Moses." So they're murmuring again, "and said, Wherefore is that thou hast brought us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst? And Moses cried to the Lord, saying, What shall I do unto this people? They be almost ready to stone me. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go on before the people, and take with thee the elders of Israel, and thy rod wherewith thou smotest the river, and take it in thine hand, and go. And behold, I will stand before thee there upon the rock in Horeb, and thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel." So here you have, just a few chapters later, from where God provided them the sweet waters at Marah, here they are again. "Moses, you brought us out to Egypt once again to die. We have nothing to drink." And they're murmuring against Moses. And Moses goes to God and says, "God, what do you want me to do? These people are ready to kill me." And God says, "Moses, you take the rod. You go over here before the rock," and he said, "I will stand before you." So notice, God is there. He says, "Moses, I want you to strike that rock. And when you strike that rock," God says, "I'm going to provide water for my people." Now, we've looked at two instances where the people needed water. They murmured, they complained. And what was God still willing to do? He was still willing to provide for his people. Sometimes God provides for his people when they do not even deserve it. We need to understand that God provides for you and me. Go over to your New Testament. Sticking with the idea of water, go over to the New Testament. Go over to John chapter number 4. An account that I know you're familiar with. You can put a marker in the book of Exodus because we're going to come back to it. But I want to show you a couple instances of God providing water. Now, obviously, in the context of John chapter number 4, we're going to find out that there's more than what Jesus is talking about than just water. But in John chapter number 4, he's come to the city of Samaria where Jacob's well was. He was thirsty, and here comes this Samaritan woman, and Jesus asks her, well, can I have some water? And of course, this brings up this discourse between Jesus and the woman here at the well. But I want you to note the words of Jesus specifically here as we get into this. Let's just pick up in verse number 10. Jesus answered and said unto her, if thou knewest the gift of God, and who it was that saith unto thee, give me to drink, thou wouldest have asked of him, and he would have given thee living water. The woman saith unto him, Sir, thou hast nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. From whence then hast thou living water? Art thou greater than our father Jacob, which gave us the well, and drank thereof himself, and his children, and his cattle? Jesus answered and said unto her, Whosoever drinketh of this water shall thirst again. But whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst, but the water that I give him shall be in him a well, a water of springing up into everlasting life. Now here Jesus, he's going to be talking spiritually here for just a moment, but I want you to understand the picture that Jesus is painting. Jesus is saying, I can provide for you something that no one else can. I can provide for you the very needs, the very necessities of this life. A matter of fact, if you go over to 1 Corinthians chapter number 10 and verse number 4, this is very interesting. You go over to 1 Corinthians chapter number 10 and verse number 4, and Paul said that Jesus was that rock that provided the water in the desert. See, Jesus is a provider. Jesus is the giver of life. He is not only the giver of physical life, as we're trying to look at, but as we're going to look at later on in this lesson, he is the giver of spiritual life. We noted it this morning in our sermon this morning in John chapter number 1 and verse number 3 and Revelation chapter number 4 and verse number 11, as Jesus is the creator. He is the one that is giving physical life. And as Jesus gives physical life, as Jesus is providing the needs of people, it is something that he does. Go over to two passages I want you to consider in the book of Matthew that I think is very important to what we're talking about. The first one is in Matthew chapter number 5. Matthew chapter number 5, there within the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, we have what we sometimes call the Beatitudes, right? Now, again, this is spiritual in nature, but consider the language that Jesus employs. In Matthew chapter number 5 and in verse number 6, he says, Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness. What's it say? For they shall be filled. Jesus providing the physical needs for his people. You're still there in the Sermon on the Mount. Fast forward to the next chapter, Matthew chapter number 6. And you know the passage. There in Matthew chapter number 6, you could start reading there in about verse number 25 and following as these people, well, verse number 25 says, Therefore I say unto you, take no thought for your life, what ye shall eat or what ye shall drink, nor yet what is on your body, what you shall put on. Is not the life more than meat and the body more than raiment? What is the point that Jesus is going to get at in this passage of scriptures? That God will provide the physical needs. He gives those two beautiful examples there within that text when he would say, consider the birds of the air. They don't sow, they don't reap, they don't gather into barns. He's talking about food. He's talking about physical things. And then what does he say? Your heavenly Father takes care of them. Now, if he's going to take care of the birds of the air, how much more so Is he going to take care of you and me? And then he gives that second example. You continue reading there. He talks about the lilies of the field, how they grow and they toil, neither do they spin. And he says, yet I say unto you that even Solomon was not arrayed in the beauty like these. In other words, you take King Solomon. Solomon was not as beautiful. He was not as well kept as the lilies of the field. And do you see the point that Jesus is making? He says, if God is going to take care of the lilies of the field, which today is, and then tomorrow is cast into the fire, how much more so will he take care of you? Will he take care of me, his creation? You know, when you consider God and the words that he employs, God does not just use random words when he communicates with me and you. God is always very specific. God is always very precise in the language in which he employs when he's talking to you and me. That's one of the beautiful things when you read and study the New Testament, especially if you look into the Greek language. And I'm not saying that you have to look into the Greek language to understand the New Testament. I'm not saying that at all. But one of the beautiful things about the Greek language is it's such a precise language. There's no ambiguity in the Greek language as there is sometime with the English language. We've used the example before. I won't do it again, but remember the example I used a few weeks ago about the English word good. And we have the same English word good, and we could use it in 4 or 5 different ways. The Greek language didn't do that. They were very specific about the words that they used. But I'm talking about God and the words that he employed. So you go back to Genesis chapter number 1. And you start reading through the days of creation. As God is creating life, what does he say? It was good. As God starts to create the sun, the moon, the stars, what does he say? It is good. As God creates the creeping things that creep upon the earth, as he creates the fowl of the air, as he creates the fish in the sea, what does God say? It was good. But on the 6th day, after he creates mankind, God employs a different word. He doesn't just say, this is good. He says it's very good. Why is that? Because you and I, mankind, is the crowning achievement of creation. Think about everything that God, think about even the psalmist would employ this when you go over to Psalm 8 there and probably about verses 3 and 4. The psalmist, David there says, you know, when I consider the works of thy fingers, the sun, the moon, and the stars, who am I that you consider? David says, well, why do you consider me, God? What am I in the vast creation, the beauty of creation? And when you really start to think about the massive, that's not good English, probably not even a good word, probably not even a word, but the massiveness, the great expanse that is creation, and then there's us. Have you ever considered what scientists call like the Milky Way universe, the universe in which we live in, that group, that cluster of stars? And then there's all these other groups and all these other clusters of stars. And understand the psalmist said, God, that's just the work of your fingers. Things that we can't even pick up with the naked eye. God created. And yet, God said of us, it was very good. God goes and provides for us. Even when we complain, even when we gripe, God says, I'm going to provide for you. Now you go back to Matthew chapter number 6, and what is the condition for the provision of God? Verse number 33, but seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. But here's the beautiful thing about God. The beautiful thing about God, because when you talk about physical blessings, there are things that God are providing for his people. Sometimes it doesn't even matter the relationship that we have for him. Jesus would say on one occasion that he causes the rain to fall on who? The just and the unjust. God provides for his people. God sometimes even provides for the crowning achievement of his creation, even when they could care less about it. Let me show you another aspect really quickly before we get into the spiritual blessings. I want to go through this really quickly. But you go back to the book of Exodus. And if you look in Exodus chapter number 16, and you look at verses 2 and 3, Exodus chapter number 16, verses 2 and 3, you have yet another account of the children of Israel, and now they're murmuring against Moses again in verse number 2. Why are they murmuring against Moses in verse number 2? Well, look at verse number 3. And the children of Israel said unto him, would to God have us, we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by flesh pots, when we did eat bread to the full, for ye have brought us forth into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Do you see how quickly man forgets, how quickly man just focuses on the wrong things? They said, God, we were in Egypt. Moses, did you know that we were in Egypt? Did you know that when we were in Egypt, we had pots of meat to eat? We have bread that we could eat until we were full. And you brought us out here in this wilderness to kill us with hunger. Do you realize what they're saying in that statement? They're telling Moses and they're telling God that we would have been better off in Egypt. Now here's the crazy thing. You go to Exodus chapter number 2, and those same people knew that they were not better off in Egypt, because what are they doing in Exodus chapter number 2? They're crying out to God, asking for help, asking for salvation. We're going to talk about the salvation of God at the end of this lesson. But the point that I'm trying to iterate in your mind, here they are once again complaining to God. But you know what God is going to do? Because they're his people, God is going to provide for them. You move on down in that same chapter to Exodus chapter number 16. And God is going to speak to Moses, verse number 11. And verse number 12, he says, I have heard the murmuring of the children of Israel, speaking of them, saying, at even ye shall eat flesh, and in the morning ye shall be filled with bread, and ye shall know that I am the Lord your God. And so it's going to come to pass in the evening that the quails came up and covered the camp, and in the morning the dew lay round about the host. And when the dew that lay was up, behold, upon the face of the wilderness there was a small round thing as the hoarfrost on the ground. And when the children of Israel saw it, they said one to another, it is manna, for they wist not what it was. And Moses said unto them, this is the bread which the Lord hath given you to eat. And so here it is. This is God saying, God telling Moses, okay, Moses, they want some food that you can go out in the morning and they can have some manna and they can have some quail. God said, I'm going to provide food for them. Now, there's a couple of lessons here. We got to go through these quick. Number one, God provided for them even though they complained. Number two, when it came to God's provision, he still had conditions. Now, what do I mean by that? God's going to put the man out there. God's going to put the quail out there. But if you go down to Exodus chapter number 16 and you read verses 22 to 24, there's going to be a commandment that these people had to follow as far as the manna was concerned, as far as the quail is concerned. You're going to go out there and you're going to gather just the amount of food that you need. If you gather too much, it's going to spoil. Now, here's the miraculous provision of God. God says, you're going to go out every day. You're going to get exactly what you need. Because tomorrow, I'm going to provide for you again. But he said, when you go out on the 6th day, you're going to gather twice as much. You're going to gather twice as much because there's not going to be anything available to you on the Sabbath day. Now, isn't that very interesting? You go out on the 5th day, and let's just say the amount that you needed was a basket of food. And so you go out on the 5th day. If you gathered 2 baskets of food, you know what was going to happen to that extra basket? It was going to spoil. It was going to grow worms. And it was going to stink. But you go on the 6th day, and you gather 2 baskets. Guess what? It's not going to spoil, it's not going to grow worms, and it's not going to stink. Why? Because you did what God said. And so God said, I'm going to provide for you, but there's still a provision. Another lesson really quickly. Even though God provided for the people, they were still something the people had to do. Sometimes that's a lesson that the world today needs to understand. God will provide these blessings for his people, but there's still something that his people need to do. There's an old it's a joke, if you will, per se, but I think it illustrates a point. There was this man, and he was living. This is not a true story, by the way. I think you'll understand that it's not a true story. But there's this man, and he's at this house, and it starts to rain, and the waters are coming up, and it's going to flood, right? And a guy comes by in a car, and he says, "All right, buddy, it's flooding. We got to get out of here." And the guy says, "Oh, well, the Lord will provide." Well, the flood waters continue to rise, and he has to go into his house. He has to go up to his second story. A guy rows by on a boat. And he says, "Okay, buddy, it's flooded. Let's get out of here. Let's go." And the guy said, "No, you go on. The Lord will provide." Well, the rain, it kept on raining. The flood waters lifted a little bit more. The guy come, and he had to get up on his roof because the flood waters were so high. A guy in a helicopter comes by, and he says, "Hey, we're going to throw down this ladder. You climb up, and we'll get you out of here." And the guy says, "No, go on. The Lord will provide." Well, flood waters got higher than the house. The guy died. He gets to, as the saying goes, if you will, we know this isn't true, but he gets to heaven's gate. And he asks God, why didn't you save me? He said, "I was waiting for you to save me." And God said, "I sent a car, I sent a boat, I sent a helicopter." So God provides for his people, but guess what? There's still something that man has to do. That's going to be physical, and that's also spiritual, as we'll look at here in just a moment. Just some New Testament verses to go along with the idea of food. I think about John chapter number 6, where Jesus fed the 5,000 with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. But even as Jesus is feeding them with the 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes, what's he doing? He says, "I'm going to provide for you the bread of life. I'm going to provide for you something far better than what Moses provided in the wilderness, the manna." God says, "I'm going to provide for you." And again, it goes back to the idea in Matthew chapter number 6 that there's something that we have to do. God is willing to provide for us. God is willing to take care of us. But there's something that we have to do. And so we see the physical blessings that God provides us with. We see those physical provisions that God gives us. But now, real quickly, for the remainder of the time that we have, I want to deal with this idea of the spiritual aspect of God providing. Sticking with the children of Israel in the book of Exodus, go back to Exodus chapter number 2. This is the passage we alluded to just a little bit ago, but we'll actually look at it this time. Go to Exodus chapter number 2 and look there with me at verse number 23. Exodus chapter number 2 and in verse number 23, "And it came to pass in the process of time that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of bondage, and they cried their cry, came unto God by reason of bondage, and God heard their groans, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob, and God looked upon his children, and God had respect unto them." And so here are the children of Israel. They are in Egyptian bondage, and understand their Egyptian bondage was not easy. You go back to Exodus chapter number 1 and you look at verses 9 through 14, and guess what happened? As the children of Israel grew in number, the king of Egypt increased their labor. He says, we got to use this labor force. We're going to increase their labor. As the children of Israel continued to grow, Pharaoh would give that heinous order to kill all the Hebrew male child. Exodus chapter number 1 and Exodus chapter number 1 and verse number 22. And yet through all this, the children of Israel are going to cry out. God is going to hear their cry. And what is he going to do? He's going to send a Savior. Now, think about this for just a moment for you and I. We live, and I think we would all agree, we live in what sometimes is a mean, cruel, and hard world. And do you know why? You know why. You know why the world is cruel. You know why it's mean. You know why it's hard, right? It's that way because of sin. When you look at the things that go on in the earth, in the world, and you look at how people treat one another, and just the terrible, the civil unrest, and just all the things that go with it, what does it all boil down to? It boils down to sin. We are in the bondage of sin. Jesus would talk about the bondage of sin. Paul would talk about the bondage of sin. Consider just a couple of passages. Go over to John chapter number 8. We think about sin and ultimately what sin leads to. Paul would tell us in Romans chapter number 6 and verse number 23 that the wages of sin is death. And so we understand what sin ultimately leads to. You see in the beginning what sin led to with Adam and Eve, how they were driven from the garden. You see what sin led to with Cain killing Abel. I don't know why I had such a hard time with that, but that's what sin led to. Could you imagine Eve for just a moment as you're turning over to the book of Romans, or the book of John? You've actually beat me there at this point because I'm talking and not turning my pages. But you ever thought about Eve and the situation that she was in? Think about this. It was her sin that caused Adam and Eve to be driven from the garden. Now, obviously, Adam sinned too, but she was the one that sinned first. And she had to bring up children in a hard, cruel world because of her sin. And because her sin brought forth other sin, she had to witness one of her children killing another one of her children because of her sin. Have you ever thought about that? That's the world that sin provides. And it is a bondage. Just as the children of Israel were in Egyptian bondage, you and I, if we're not careful, we find ourselves under the bondage of sin. Look at John chapter number 8. John chapter number 8, look at verse number 34. And Jesus answered, Verily, verily, I say unto you, that whosoever committeth sin is the servant, the bondservant, the slave of sin. Put your hand there in John chapter number 8, because Paul, interestingly enough, says the very same thing over in Romans chapter number 6. In Romans chapter number 6, notice what Paul says in Romans chapter number 6 in verse number 16. Romans chapter number 6 and in verse number 16, he says, Know ye not to whom ye yield yourselves servants to obey? His servants ye are, to whom you obey, whether of sin unto death or of obedience unto righteousness. And so each and every one of us here this evening, we are a slave, whether you like it or not. You are a slave this evening. But here's the beautiful thing. You get to choose who your master is. Go back to John really quickly. Maybe put your hand back in Romans chapter number 6. We're going to come back to it. Go back to John chapter number 8. Notice what Jesus says starting in verse number 35. And the servant abideth not in the house forever, but the Son abideth forever. If the Son therefore shall make you free, ye shall be free indeed. I know that ye are Abraham's seed, but ye seek to kill me, because my word hath no place in you. I speak that which I have seen with my Father, and ye do that which ye have seen with my Father. Now, go back up in that same chapter to verse number 32. And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Make you free from what? Make you free from the bondage of sin. It is the Son who abideth forever that can make us free from the bondage of sin. Go back to Romans chapter number 6. Notice what Paul said in verse 17. But God be thanked that ye were the servants of sin, but ye have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered unto you. Being then made free from sin, ye became the servants or the slaves of righteousness. You see what it is? Jesus is saying that we are in the bondage of sin. But because of him, the Son who abideth forever, he can set you free. John chapter number 8 in verse number 32. And Paul reiterates that in Romans chapter number 6 and says, you get to choose. Are you going to be the slave of sin, or are you going to be the slave of Jesus? In the case of the Romans, Paul was so thankful that those individuals who were once under the bondage of sin, under the yoke of sin, they got out of that. Now, here it is. Here it is in the plain as it can be. God is the one that sets men free. You go back to the book of Exodus. And although Moses was going to be the spokesperson, who was it that set the children of Israel free? It was God. Go back to the book of Exodus. Go back to the book of Exodus. I want to show you the salvation of God, the salvation that God offers. Go to Exodus chapter number 14. There's some beautiful thoughts in Exodus chapter number 14 to consider. Now, you look and you have the hardness of Pharaoh's heart, so he's going to follow them out into the wilderness, and he's going to try to stand there. And here it is, the people, they're afraid. And look what they said in verse number 11 and 12 of Exodus chapter number 14. These are the children of Israel who just got released from Egyptian bondage. And notice what they say in verse number 11. They said unto Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, thou hast taken us away to die in the wilderness. Wherefore hast thou dealt thus with us to carry us forth out of Egypt? Is not this the word that we did tell thee in Egypt, saying, let us alone, that we may be slaves to the Egyptians? For it had been better for us to serve the Egyptians than we should die in the wilderness. See, they're still complaining. But notice what God does. And Moses, verse number 13, said unto the people, fear ye not, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will show you today. For the Egyptians whom you have seen today, ye shall see them again no more forever. The Lord shall fight for you, and ye shall hold your peace. God provided a way. Look at verse number 30 of that same chapter. Exodus chapter 14, verse number 30. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead upon the seashore. And Israel saw the great work which the Lord did upon the Egyptians. And the people feared the Lord and believed the Lord and his servant Moses. See, God saved his people. God provided the way of salvation for his people. He did it for the children of Israel, and you know that he did it for us. You think about John chapter number 3 and verse number 16, that well-known verse. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever should believe on him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Do you see what God did? God provides the way of salvation. Now, let me just add this one more thing, and then the lesson will be yours. You go back, and you don't have to turn over there. You know the account. There's another account. This one's actually found in the book of Numbers, where God saves his people, even in the midst of murmuring and complaining. It's interesting because God had already saved them once for the Egyptians. But in the book of Numbers, in Numbers chapter number 21, the children of Israel were murmuring and complaining. And one of the things that God did, he had enough of their murmuring and complaining on this occasion. You remember, he sent fiery serpents down amongst the children of Israel. And as the children of Israel were getting bit by these serpents, man, they were dying. But because of the God we serve, because God is the provider of salvation, he says, this is what we're going to do. He said, we're going to take a bronze serpent, we're going to put it on the staff, we're going to set this staff up here. If someone gets bit by a snake, all they've got to do is look up at that serpent. God will save them. He had already saved them from the Egyptians. Now he's provided a second way of salvation. You can be saved from these snakes. Think of it in this way. When you and I enter the watery grave of baptism, God has offered salvation through the blood of his Son. But sometimes we get to be like the children of Israel, and we start to murmur and complain, and we lose sight of everything that God has done, and we walk away. We walk back into the world of sin.
God says, I tell you what, because I love you so much, I'll provide a way for you to come home. You can repent of whatever sin that you have. You can confess that sin, and you can pray to the Heavenly Father. And I love 1 John chapter number 1 and verse 9. I quote it a lot. God is faithful. God is just. Here it is. He will forgive you of those sins. Now think about that in the context. He's not talking about someone that has never obeyed the gospel of Christ. He's talking to someone that obeyed the gospel of Christ, went back into the world, and God is saying, if you will come home, I will forgive you. It's kind of like the prodigal son, isn't it not? The prodigal son took his living, he wasted it. He comes to himself. I love that terminology. When he came to himself, he says, I have it better in my father's house. The Bible says when the father seen him afar off, the father ran to him. Understand that if you're here this morning, if you're here this evening, you are a child of God, but you're not living like it, God is standing ready to run to you if you will return. God's ready to provide for you not only physically, but He's ready to provide for you spiritually. Maybe you're here this evening, you're not a child of God. Maybe you've never done those things that God is requiring of you. What are you waiting for? We're not promised another day. We're not promised another moment. You don't have to know everything. You don't have to know everything. I don't know everything. I learn something more about God every day, and it's beautiful. But if you know that you're in sin, if you know what you need to do to get your life right with Him, I'm begging you this evening to do that. The water is ready. We will help you take care of that need this evening. Don't leave here in an unsaved state. We serve a God that is ready and willing to help you. We serve a God that is ready and willing to save you this very evening. If you are here and you are subject to the Lord's invitation, it is our request, it is our prayer that you come forward and you obey that gospel plan this evening as together we stand and we sing.